Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into the fascinating story of America's first state, Delaware. That's right. When it comes to statehood, Delaware holds a unique place in American history as the very first colony to ratify the U.S. Constitution. But Delaware's story begins long before 1787, stretching back to indigenous people, European explorers, and a complex web of colonial powers that shaped this small but mighty state. Why does Delaware call itself the first state? How did this tiny territory become such a crucial player in American history? And what wild twists and turns happened along the way? Stick around, because we're about to uncover the complete founding story of Delaware, from its earliest inhabitants to its pivotal role in creating the United States of America. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more American history content. Let's get started. Before any European ever set foot on Delaware soil, this land was home to the Lenape people, also known as the Delaware Indians. For thousands of years, the Lenape thrived in the region that would become Delaware, as well as parts of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. The Lenape weren't a single unified tribe, but rather a collection of related groups who spoke dialects of the Algonquian language. In the Delaware region, the primary groups were the Unami and Unalachtigo. These people were incredibly resourceful, living in harmony with the land and waters around them. The Lenape lifestyle was deeply connected to the seasons. They lived in small villages along rivers and streams, particularly near the Delaware River, which would later bear their name. Their homes, called wigwams, were dome-shaped structures made from wooden frames covered with bark or woven mats. These weren't permanent dwellings in the way we think of houses today. The Lenape were semi-nomadic, moving seasonally to take advantage of different food sources. In the spring and summer, they planted crops, the three sisters of corn, beans, and squash, which grew together in a symbiotic relationship that enriched the soil and maximized yields. The women typically handled agricultural duties, while men hunted and fished. The Delaware Bay and River provided an abundance of fish, oysters, and clams. In fact, archaeologists have found massive shell middens, ancient trash heaps of discarded shells, that tell us just how central seafood was to the Lenape diet. Hunting was another crucial activity. Deer, bear, turkey, and smaller game populated the forests. The Lenape used every part of the animals they hunted: meat for food, hides for clothing and shelter, bones for tools, and sinew for thread. Nothing went to waste. The Lenape also had a rich spiritual life. They believed in a creator called Kishelamukong and maintained that all living things had spirits that deserved respect. This worldview influenced how they interacted with nature. They took only what they needed and gave thanks for what the land provided. Trade networks connected the Lenape to other indigenous peoples across a vast territory. They traded shells, particularly wampum beads made from whelk and clam shells, which served both as decoration and as a form of currency and record keeping. These trade routes would later become some of the first roads used by European colonists. By the time Europeans arrived in the early 1600s, the Lenape population in the Delaware region is estimated to have been several thousand strong. They had no concept of land ownership in the European sense. Land was communal, used by the group but not possessed by individuals. This fundamental difference in worldview would lead to tragic misunderstandings and conflicts in the centuries to come. The first European to explore what would become Delaware was likely Henry Hudson, an English explorer sailing for the Dutch East India Company. In 1609, while searching for the elusive Northwest Passage to Asia, Hudson sailed his ship, the Half Moon, into Delaware Bay. He didn't stay long. The shallow waters and strong currents made navigation difficult, and Hudson decided to continue north, where he would instead explore the river that now bears his name in New York. Hudson's brief visit put Delaware on European maps, but the real colonization efforts didn't begin until a few years later. In 1610, English explorer Samuel Argall, sailing from Virginia, sought shelter from a storm in Delaware Bay. He named the bay and river after Virginia's governor at the time, Lord Delaware, and thus Delaware entered the historical record, even though Lord Delaware himself never visited the region. The Dutch were the first to seriously attempt colonization. In 1631, a group of Dutch settlers established Zwanendale, meaning Valley of the Swans, near present-day Lewis, Delaware. The settlement was intended as a whaling station and trading post, led by Captain David Pietersen de Vries. About 30 colonists built a settlement and prepared to harvest whale oil from the whales that frequented Delaware Bay. Tragically, the Zwanendale experiment ended in disaster. In 1632, when de Vries returned to check on the colony, he found it completely destroyed. All 32 settlers had been killed. The exact circumstances remain somewhat murky, but historical accounts suggest the conflict arose from a cultural misunderstanding. The Dutch had erected a metal coat of arms displaying their claim to the land. A Lenape chief reportedly took the metal plate, likely viewing it as an interesting object rather than understanding its symbolic importance to the Europeans. When the Dutch confronted the Lenape about the missing emblem, tensions escalated, ultimately resulting in the massacre of the entire settlement. This violent beginning set a troubling precedent for European indigenous relations in Delaware. The Dutch, however, were not deterred from the region entirely. They continued to view the Delaware River Valley as strategically valuable, particularly for the fur trade that was proving so profitable in New Netherland to the north. Here's where Delaware's story gets really interesting. In 1638, Sweden entered the colonial competition in North America with the establishment of New Sweden. 2 Swedish ships, the Kalmar Nickel and the Fogel Grip, arrived at the mouth of the Delaware River, carrying about 50 colonists and soldiers. They were led by Peter Minuit, a former director of New Netherland, who had famously purchased Manhattan Island for the Dutch before being dismissed from his position. The Swedes landed at a place they called Fort Christina, named after the 12-year-old Queen Christina of Sweden. This settlement, located at present-day Wilmington, Delaware, became the first permanent European settlement in the Delaware Valley. The date of their landing, March 29th, 1638, marks the beginning of continuous European presence in Delaware. Why would Sweden, a relatively small Scandinavian nation, want to establish a colony in North America? The answer lies in economics and prestige. Sweden was emerging as a European power during the 30 Years' War, and controlling a piece of the New World offered opportunities for wealth through trade, particularly in furs and tobacco. Plus, establishing overseas colonies was seen as a mark of a great nation. The Swedish colony was never large. At its peak, New Sweden probably had fewer than 400 colonists. But what the Swedes lacked in numbers, they made up for in innovation. The Swedish settlers introduced log cabin construction to North America, a building technique that would become iconic in American frontier settlement. These sturdy, weather-resistant structures were far better suited to the harsh winters than the English-style timber frame houses. The Swedes also maintained generally peaceful relations with the Lenape. They engaged in fair trade, respected indigenous customs to some extent, and didn't aggressively expand their territorial claims. Swedish colonists learned indigenous languages and agricultural techniques. In fact, several Swedish settlers married Lenape women, creating some of the first multicultural families in the region. Life in New Sweden was hard, but survivable. Colonists grew tobacco as a cash crop, which they exported back to Europe. They also traded for beaver pelts and other furs with indigenous peoples. Small farms dotted the landscape along the Delaware River, and settlers raised livestock and grew vegetables. The colony was governed by a series of governors appointed from Sweden. The most notable was Johann Prince, who arrived in 1643 and governed for 10 years. Prince was a colorful character, a massive man weighing over 400 pounds, known for his iron-fisted rule and short temper. He built a fortified residence called Prinshof and worked to expand Swedish influence in the region, sometimes coming into conflict with Dutch traders who also claimed rights to the area. Under Prince's governance, New Sweden expanded to include settlements in present-day Pennsylvania and New Jersey, as well as Delaware. The Swedes built several forts along the Delaware River to protect their interests and assert their territorial claims. However, the colony struggled with chronic problems. Insufficient support from Sweden, which was preoccupied with European conflicts, and too few colonists to effectively settle and defend the vast territory they claimed. The Dutch, who had never fully abandoned their claim to the region, watched New Sweden's expansion with increasing alarm. The stage was set for conflict between these two colonial powers. By the early 1650s, tensions between New Sweden and New Netherland had reached a boiling point. Both colonies claimed overlapping territories, and the Dutch viewed Swedish expansion as a direct threat to their interests. The Dutch colony of New Netherland, centered in present-day New York, was larger, better funded, and more heavily populated than New Sweden. It was only a matter of time before the Dutch moved to assert their dominance. In 1655, Peter Stuyvesant, the hot-tempered Director General of New Netherland, decided to end the Swedish challenge once and for all. He assembled a force of 7 ships and about 300 soldiers, a massive show of force by colonial standards. In September 1655, this Dutch armada sailed into Delaware Bay and up the Delaware River. The Swedes were hopelessly outnumbered. After brief resistance at Fort Christina, the Swedish garrison surrendered. Stuyvesant then moved up the river and captured the other Swedish forts. Within 2 weeks, New Sweden had fallen, and Dutch control was established over an entire Delaware River Valley. The conquest was relatively bloodless. No major battles were fought, and the Swedish colonists were permitted to remain on their lands under Dutch rule. The Dutch called their new territory New Amstel and established their administrative center at Fort Casimir, which they renamed Fort Amstel, near present-day Newcastle, Delaware. The town of New Amstel was laid out with typical Dutch precision: neat, organized streets, and centralized planning. Some Dutch families relocated from New Netherland to settle in the newly acquired territory. However, Dutch control of Delaware would prove short-lived. Back in Europe, conflicts between the Netherlands and England were escalating. England had never recognized Dutch claims in North America and viewed the Dutch presence as an obstacle to English expansion. The English colonies of Maryland and Virginia bordered the Delaware region, and English traders wanted access to the lucrative Delaware River trade routes. In 1664, King Charles II of England granted his brother, the Duke of York, a charter for all the land between the Connecticut and Delaware rivers. This was, of course, mostly land, already controlled by the Dutch. But English might would make English right. 4 English ships commanded by Colonel Richard Nichols sailed into New Amsterdam's harbor in August 1664 and demanded the surrender of the Dutch colony. Peter Stuyvesant wanted to fight, but the colonists of New Amsterdam refused to support him. The city's defenses were inadequate, and the citizens saw no point in risking their lives for a distant trading company. Stuyvesant reluctantly surrendered New Netherland to the English without firing a shot. New Amsterdam became New York, named after its new proprietor, the Duke of York. The English takeover of New Netherland automatically included the Dutch settlements in Delaware. English control was now established over the entire mid-Atlantic coast, from Virginia to New England. Delaware, that small piece of land along the Delaware River and Bay, had now been ruled by Swedes, Dutch, and English, all within the span of just 30 years. Under English rule, Delaware's political status became complicated and would remain so for the next century. The Duke of York, as proprietor, had broad powers over his new territories. In 1682, he granted the Delaware region to William Penn, the Quaker who had just established Pennsylvania as a haven for religious freedom. William Penn desperately wanted Delaware, or the lower counties as they were called, for a specific reason: access to the Atlantic Ocean. Pennsylvania's original charter gave Penn a vast inland territory, but no direct access to the sea. The Delaware River was Pennsylvania's gateway to oceanic trade, and Penn needed to control both banks of that river to ensure Philadelphia could function as a major port. The Duke of York granted Penn the lower counties, and Delaware became part of Pennsylvania's sphere of influence. However, Delaware's residents had mixed feelings about this arrangement. Many of the Dutch and Swedish descendants who populated Delaware had little in common with the Quaker settlers pouring into Pennsylvania. They spoke different languages, practiced different religions, and had different cultural traditions. From 1682 to 1701, Delaware sent representatives to the Pennsylvania Assembly in Philadelphia, but tensions persisted. The lower counties felt their interests were being ignored by the much larger Pennsylvania population. Pennsylvania's Quaker majority was pacifist and often opposed funding defense measures, a particular concern for Delaware, which was more exposed to attacks from the sea and had a history of conflict with indigenous peoples. In 1701, William Penn granted Delaware a critical concession. He issued the Charter of Privileges, which allowed Delaware to form its own legislative assembly separate from Pennsylvania, though both territories still shared the same governor. This was the beginning of Delaware's path to independent identity, even as it technically remained under Pennsylvania's proprietor. Delaware's separate assembly first met in 1704 in New Castle, which had become the territory's capital. The assembly consisted of representatives from Delaware's 3 counties, Newcastle, Kent, and Sussex. These same 3 counties still constitute Delaware today, making Delaware the only state whose county structure has remained unchanged since colonial times. Life in colonial Delaware was primarily agricultural. The flat, fertile land was perfect for growing wheat, corn, and other crops. Water-powered mills sprung up along Delaware's many streams and creeks, grinding grain into flour that was exported to other colonies and the Caribbean. The town of Wilmington, built on the site of the old Fort Christina, grew as a milling center and port. Slavery tragically became entrenched in Delaware during this period. While Delaware would eventually become a border state between North and South, in the colonial period, it was very much a slave-holding society. Enslaved Africans worked on farms throughout Delaware, particularly in the southern counties of Kent and Sussex. The slave trade flowed through Delaware's ports, and wealthy landowners built their fortunes on the labor of enslaved people. Delaware's population grew slowly but steadily through the colonial period. English settlers arrived in increasing numbers, but the Dutch and Swedish communities maintained their distinct identities for generations. By the mid-1700s, Delaware had also attracted Scots-Irish immigrants fleeing poverty in Ulster as well as some German settlers. This ethnic diversity gave Delaware a unique character among the English colonies. Religious diversity matched ethnic diversity. While Quakers were influential, particularly in the northern part of Delaware near Pennsylvania, other denominations flourished too. Swedish Lutherans maintained their church, Old Swedes Church in Wilmington, built in 1698 and still standing today as one of the oldest churches in America. Anglicans, Presbyterians, and other Protestant groups also established congregations. Delaware's economy was tied to both land and sea. In addition to agriculture and milling, fishing and shipbuilding became important industries. Delaware Bay provided abundant oysters, clams, and fish. The tidal marshes along the coast were harvested for salt hay used as fodder for livestock. Small shipyards built vessels for coastal trade. Throughout the colonial period, Delaware existed in a somewhat ambiguous political state, legally connected to Pennsylvania but functionally independent, small in size but strategically located, diverse in population but unified in a desire for self-governance. This unique situation would profoundly influence Delaware's response to the revolutionary crisis of the 1770s. As tensions between the American colonies and Great Britain escalated in the 1760s and 1770s, Delaware found itself in a delicate position. The colony's economy depended heavily on trade with Britain and other colonies. Delaware's merchants, millers, and farmers had no desire to disrupt the commercial relationships that brought them prosperity. Yet, like colonists throughout America, Delawareans resented British taxation without representation and interference in colonial self-governance. The Sugar Act of 1764, the Stamp Act of 1760, the Townshend Acts of 1767, each new British tax and regulation prompted protests in Delaware, though generally less dramatic than the demonstrations in Massachusetts or Virginia. Delaware didn't have a Boston Tea Party, but Delawareans did participate in non-importation agreements, refusing to buy British goods in protest of unjust taxation. When the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in 1774, Delaware sent 3 delegates, Caesar Rodney, Thomas McKean, and George Red. These three men would play pivotal roles in Delaware's revolutionary story. Rodney was a wealthy planter from Dover, known for his patriotism and leadership. McKean was a lawyer originally from Pennsylvania, fiery and committed to independence. Reed was more conservative, cautious about breaking with Britain. The outbreak of fighting at Lexington and Concord in April 1775 forced Delaware to take a stand. The Delaware Assembly voted to raise a regiment of soldiers, the Delaware Regiment, which would fight with distinction throughout the Revolutionary War. Delaware's soldiers earned the nickname the Blue Hen's Chickens after the aggressive fighting cocks that Delaware soldiers raised and fought for entertainment during the war. The blue hen chicken would later become Delaware's state bird. On June 15, 1776, the Delaware Assembly voted to suspend all ties with the British Crown and Pennsylvania's proprietor. Delaware declared itself an independent state, no longer part of Pennsylvania. A constitutional convention was called, and Delaware began writing its own constitution. Then came the critical moment, the vote on independence. When the Second Continental Congress prepared to vote on Richard Henry Lee's resolution for independence on July 2, 1770, Delaware's three-man delegation was split. Reed opposed independence, believing it premature. McKean favored it. Rodney was back in Delaware, dealing with loyalist opposition and military matters. The story of Caesar Rodney's midnight ride is one of Delaware's most cherished legends. When Rodney received word that his vote was needed to break Delaware's deadlock, he immediately mounted his horse and rode through the night, 80 miles through a thunderstorm, despite suffering from cancer and asthma. He arrived in Philadelphia on July 2nd, exhausted and mud-splattered, just in time to cast Delaware's deciding vote for independence. Delaware voted yes, and independence was declared. Caesar Rodney's ride symbolizes Delaware's commitment to the American cause. Despite the personal cost, Rodney would eventually die from his cancer in 1784, having sacrificed his health in service to his state and nation. Today, his silhouette on horseback appears on Delaware's state quarter, ensuring his midnight ride is remembered. The Revolutionary War brought hardship to Delaware. British naval forces controlled Delaware Bay, disrupting trade and threatening coastal communities. In 1771, British General William Howe's army marched through northern Delaware on their way to capture Philadelphia. The Battle of Couch's Bridge, fought on September 3, 1777, near Newark, Delaware, was the only Revolutionary War battle fought on Delaware soil. Though small, it marked the first time the Stars and Stripes, the American flag, was flown in battle. Delaware's Delaware Regiment fought courageously in major battles throughout the war. At the Battle of Long Island, the Battle of White Plains, the Battle of Princeton, and especially at the Battle of Camden in South Carolina, Delaware soldiers distinguished themselves. General George Washington himself praised the Delaware Regiment for their courage and discipline. When American victory finally came in 1783, Delaware faced the challenge of building a new political system. The Articles of Confederation, America's first constitution, created a weak national government that struggled to manage the economy, conduct foreign relations, or maintain order. By the mid-1780s, many leaders recognized the need for a stronger federal government. In 1787, delegates from 12 states, Rhode Island refused to participate, gathered in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. Delaware sent 5 delegates, including George Read, Gunning Bedford Jr., and John Dickinson, all leading figures in Delaware politics. These Delaware delegates had specific concerns. As the smallest state in area and one of the smallest in population, Delaware feared being dominated by larger states like Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts. The Great Compromise, which created a bicameral Congress with proportional representation in the House and equal representation in the Senate, directly addressed Delaware's concerns. With 2 senators just like every other state, Delaware would have an equal voice in federal legislation, despite its small size. When the Constitutional Convention completed its work in September 1710, the new Constitution required ratification by at least 9 states to take effect. Each state would hold a special ratifying convention to debate and vote on the Constitution. Delaware moved quickly. On December 7th, 1782, just 3 months after the Constitution was signed, 30 delegates gathered at Patel's Tavern in Dover for Delaware's ratifying convention. The debate was remarkably short. The delegates recognized that the Constitution protected Delaware's interests through equal state representation in the Senate and through protections for small state sovereignty. On December 7, 1787, Delaware became the first state to ratify the United States Constitution. The vote was unanimous, 30-2. Delaware had earned its title, the first state. Why did Delaware act so quickly? Several factors contributed. The state's leaders strongly supported a stronger federal government to regulate commerce and provide security. The Constitution's provisions protected small state interests, and Delaware's small size meant organizing a ratifying convention was logistically simpler than in larger states. By being first, Delaware made a bold statement about confidence in the new federal system. Other states followed. Pennsylvania 5 days later, New Jersey the week after that, until in June 1788, when New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify, the Constitution took effect. And there you have it, the complete founding story of Delaware, the first state. From the Lenape people who first called this land home, through Swedish log cabins and Dutch rule, to English colonization and ultimately American statehood, Delaware's history is a fascinating journey through early American history. What makes Delaware's story so compelling is how this small territory, just 96 miles long and between 9 and 35 miles wide, played such an outsized role in American history. Delaware's vote for independence was crucial. Its ratification of the Constitution was first, and throughout its history, Delaware has punched above its weight class. Today, Delaware remains the first state, proud of its history and its role in founding the American nation. From the Swedish heritage celebrated in Wilmington to the colonial architecture of Newcastle to the coastal communities along Delaware Bay, the state's founding story remains visible in its landscape and culture. Caesar Rodney's Midnight Ride, the landing at Fort Christina, the ratification at Dover, these aren't just Delaware stories, they're American stories, reminding us that even the smallest voices can make the biggest difference. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Delaware's founding history, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more American history content. Got questions or comments about Delaware's history? Drop them in the comments below. I love reading your thoughts and discussing history with you all. And if you want to suggest which state's founding story we should cover next, let me know. There are 49 more states to go, each with their own unique and fascinating stories. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep exploring history